So the alternate title of this podcast was If Your Kids Are Lawyers, which was a phrase that got used a lot around the O'Rourke household.
Maria would say that often. I'm raising lawyers, and she said it complaining, but it's ended up being true and good. So we want
no
to talk
official
about
lawyers
that.
yet.
That's correct.
We got Madeline's thinking about law school, but other than that, not quite.
Yeah, they've all been well trained to be lawyers.
So the reason we wanted to kind of discuss this topic is because so often today, political discourse devolves very quickly. In fact, societal discourse, whether it's about politics, whether it's about religion, devolves from discussion into argument into a fight. And you said something really interesting as we were kind of prepping for what we wanted to talk about in the podcast, that starts in the home.
Right. Yeah, that comes from St. Angela Merici. And what she said was the disorder in society is a result of the disorder in the family. So you can always go back to the family and say, like, what's happening, what's already happened there, because we're seeing it blowing up out in society in general. And so it just got me thinking of like, I wanted to talk about, like, let's talk about how to have a discussion, talk about things with people in society. But then as I was talking to you about it, I was realizing, well, a lot of this comes from like what we've done in the family, and how, like, I'd like other people to be that respectful to others as they get into that kind of into that kind of discussion. And so then we thought, well, this is a good place to talk about, like, how do you talk to your kids about what's negotiable, like what's up for discussion, what's up for debate, and what does that actually look like?
Yeah, because I think that from my perspective, growing up, adults had everything figured out. And so as I've become, gotten older, I'm 28, so I guess that means that I'm an adult. When little kids ask questions, you want to give answers that make it look like you have it all put together. But oftentimes you don't. Oftentimes, whatever the topic might be, you've got a good idea, you've got something you've thought through to some degree, but maybe it's not your final decision. Maybe even if it is what you think is the final decision, it could be wrong. How, as a parent, do you handle when your kids bring something up, you give them an answer, and then you kind of realize afterwards, you know what, I don't have any necessarily any basis for that. For instance, a great practical example. When I was young, I like to sleep with it super cold. It's 45 degrees outside in Denver right now. I sleep with the window open. It'll get down to 20 and I'll still have the window open. I would rather be bundled up and like freezing at my face and the rest of my body all cozy. And so growing up, I loved to have a fan on every night. And you would always say, no, you can't sleep with the fan. It's too expensive. It's too expensive. It's too expensive. It wasn't until I was in my mid-20s that a buddy of mine for my birthday got me this device that plugs into the wall, and you plug your different things into that outlet, and it'll allow you to remotely turn your devices on and off, but it'll also track the power usage of whatever the device is, and it'll tell you how much that costs. And I found out that if you were to leave a fan on all night, every night, it would cost you $2.13 every month. And so that rule about, no, you can't leave the fan on all night because it's going to cost too much money, actually didn't come from any basis in fact. How do you handle stuff like that?
Yeah, and now one of the things that we have to do in this, in our family, is multiply everything by 10. So we had it play, everybody wanted their fan, and it was like, there were other things at play. Like, are you going to be tripping over cords? Is it going to be the fan on top? Is it going to be like one person likes it and one doesn't? But I think coming back to your point of like, how do we get into this kind of a discussion? How do you respond when your children are asking you that? And so, for instance, in this particular situation, I didn't know how much it actually cost. I assumed that it cost more than it did. And so I was operating off of that information, which was flawed. I think some of it came into my own sleep. So selfishly, my own sleep patterns. I don't like noise at night. And there's this hum in the background that some of my kids have said, hey, that's great. Maria likes background noise, and I don't. Like, I like as close to silence as possible. But I didn't get into that conversation with you. And I think that, the reality is some of that was negotiable. And I think, why didn't I do that? If I'm honest with myself, some of it was just easier not to have the conversation. I didn't want to have to discuss it. But what I wasn't doing was I wasn't giving you the opportunity to say, hey, well, like, I really appreciate this and I sleep better. And then I have to get outside of myself and say, well, hold on a second. Like, I love my child, and my child is not asking for me to do anything that's immoral. And this may actually be a good for them. And, maybe I should be looking into how much this actually cost. I didn't, because I wanted just to, I mean, quite frankly, at that point in my life, I was really in tune to myself. And so, like, my needs, my wants. And I thought I was just parenting by giving the decision. Perhaps that's revelatory of what I got growing up and what I was passing on. But I see today, it's like, that, and I do things differently with the kids today. Most of the time, I still fall into my patterns, where I want to just listen a little bit longer and say, wait a second, don't just think about this as a younger person, as my child asking me this, but think about this as like, this is one of God's children's, and I'm responsible for you temporally, and God is more invested in you than I am, even though you're my child. And so, like, what do you, what are you bringing to the table? Maybe I need to consider this more. And I didn't do that well, but I would tell parents today, it's like, listen, see what they do have to say, because there might be something very well for you to learn in the midst of that.
I think part of the reason, though, that it's so much easier to not listen is because if you let them, kids are going to ask a million questions. Mm-hmm. There's always a follow-up question. In fact, I think it was in Pinocchio. The Pinocchio's asking Geppetto, why this? And Geppetto says, oh, because of whatever. He goes, well, why? Oh, because of this. Well, why? Because of this. And then finally he goes, why? And Geppetto goes, just because. And Pinocchio says, oh, because. But I think that's what childhood is like. And so there's this, it's exhausting to have to constantly give a reason. But I think that the payoff for that is that if you actually take the time to have these discussions with your children, then you're establishing a pattern, specifically with stuff that's up for debate. You're establishing a pattern that I don't have everything figured out. Being an adult doesn't mean that everything is figured out. And thinking one thing and then changing your mind is totally okay. It's all right to be wrong. And coming back to kind of what we touched on a little bit earlier, I think part of the reason that so many discussions turn into arguments, turn into fights, is because we have this idea baked into our minds that if I'm wrong about something, then that tears me down as a person. It means that I'm less good of a person. And so I can't be wrong about this. And so if you bring up an argument that kind of like rocks me a little bit, then that's not just rocking this thing that I think, I'll just adjust to a better idea. That's rocking me as a person. And those pathways are formed with how these discussions are carried out with your kids. Yeah.
And I think that's a bad example that I think was ingrained. I know it was ingrained in me, and it's would have been ingrained in you. Even though we did have discussions, there were times where, like, I wanted to stop it, and it's appropriate. There are times where it's like, okay, it's 10 o'clock at night, and I need to go to bed. You need to go to bed. But how I end that discussion also needs to be done respectfully, and so that when we get back to that because means there be a cause. This is right now not the time to talk more about what those causes are. And I think even deeper, it's like, well, why do kids say why? And the reason that they say why is because we're made for the infinite, and the infinite never lacks another answer. And so what I don't want to do is squelch in my kids their desire to know more, to want more, because the ultimate answer to that, the final cause, the final reason is God, and He is going to satisfy us. And so in some ways, like I need to facilitate your travel to God by being open to those discussions, especially with things that are negotiable. Plus, there's this other deeper thing that happens is that when I stop and I stop myself, that's when I'm stopping. I'm stopping myself from wanting just to move on. And I'm instead spending the time with you, listening to your reasoning and your request for more information. I'm actually also loving you. I'm saying, you know what? You are worth me listening to you. You're worth, and you've got an opinion. So it's worth me listening to you, and you have an opinion that is worthwhile. And if there's something wrong with that, then I'll talk you through that. But I also need to be willing to gracefully, when you bring up something, which you will, where I'm wrong, it's like I need to be able to say, you know what, that's a good point. You know, I think you're right.
Well, because it's actually, as you're saying this, something comes to mind, which is that often we think of parenting as a parent parenting a kid. You know, and it's almost like this one-way street. And in fact, that there's a line that gets used a lot when it's like you love a child, especially little kids, unconditionally because they can give you nothing in return. And that's not true. You as a parent, absolutely most of the time, high percentage of the time, are bringing knowledge of the world and how to look at the world to your kids. And you are God's hand in their life, forming them as a person. But God put them in your life to form you as a person, to be a purging fire. And so sometimes they're asking a bunch of questions and the answers are just like, it's exhausting to give them. And so the purging fires, it's teaching you humility, it's teaching you all of these, patience. But sometimes God is having your child ask you a line of questioning, which leads you to something that you hadn't really talked about or hadn't really thought about before, or to a position that you hadn't held.
Right, absolutely. I think of a funny example of that when I'm pretty decent at fishing. And so I took you fishing, and there was a pond across the street at in our house in Florida, and I was all excited to live near water. And so I took my son to teach you how to fish, and you were doing it all wrong. Like you were slapping the water, and you weren't doing things right. And I was getting really frustrated. And Mom was just like, Michael, just let him do what he wants to do. And I was like, fine, he's never going to catch anything. And within 2 minutes, you were reeling in a fish, and we got a picture of. And I was all delighted that you had caught a fish. I'm like, how'd you catch? You can't catch a fish that way. You totally did catch a fish that way. And it was just this wick, and we have that picture still on your dresser. And it's me and you holding the fish and smiling, but there's this deeper message in it to me from God, just saying like, oh, so you know how to catch fish. You're going to learn new ways to catch fish through your son. He's going to do things that you think are totally wrong, and they're not. It's another perspective. And so I would push that forward into society today, and then back into the family where it needs to be done well. Is it like I'll see in society where there's argumentation, and you have the one side screaming, that color right there is yellow, and the other side is screaming and saying, no, that color is blue. And neither one are really saying, well, you think it's yellow, really? Can you show me, how do you see it's yellow? And he's like, yeah, come over here and look from here. And when you come over here and look from where they're standing, it is yellow. Why? Because the thing that we're looking at is a diamond, and a diamond has different facets. It's the same thing, but seen from different perspectives, it gives off a different color, which is beautiful and amazing, but you're never going to get there unless you're able to see from the other person's perspective. So in the same way with our children, we need to allow our children to enjoy the diamonds in life, to enjoy the wonder and awe of creation and of relationship. And in order to do that, we need to very practically, when they're saying things, when our children are saying things, to say where are you coming from? What do you see? And how many times I think of in my own life where my child was telling me something that I couldn't see, and so I didn't believe it to be true until later. Either my wife pointed out, or I happened to pass by their view and look and go, oh my gosh, what you saw made sense. I understand where you're coming from. And so that trains ourselves to be open, to be patient, and to seek to understand first before we're made. And there's even one of the Proverbs, I think it's around Proverb 15 to 18, and that range that talks about A fool is he who listens to one side of a story and then makes a decision. It's like, no, you need to listen to both. And so I think it's important for us to be training ourselves and our kids to be open to hearing the other side.
Let's talk about that really practically for a second, because you talked about the way that you were raised trained you to not even engage in these discussions, to just say, no, this is the rule, this is where we're going. And I think that there are a lot of people who work from that starting point. How, in the last episode of the podcast, you talked about the oxygen mask, putting it on yourself first, then your kids. One, how do you train yourself to be introspective in that way? And then two, how do you pass that same mentality onto your kids?
Yeah, I think, first of all, with myself, and I think any parent out there is going to know, it doesn't take long before you realize, wow, I've been wrong. And so that's the first thing is like, I need to know that I don't see things, like I'm not God. I don't see things perfectly. And to remind ourselves of that when we're dealing with our kids, because it's like, know that. And then when it comes to interacting with them, like, okay, how do I train myself? To ask myself, like, I have to say, like, why am I being firm on this particular decision? Is it truly true? Do I know for sure that this is the way that things are? Or is it the possibility that there's more to it? So I think just having this attitude of appropriate openness, is really, I just have to tell myself that. And then the question comes up like, yes, but I'm in a parenting relationship. I need to get things done. It's like, okay, great. That's true. And one of the things you need to get done is good parenting. So the good parenting you need to do is to train yourself to be open, because you're the very thing that you're hoping that your child does is to be open to what you have to say. And if you're not modeling being open to what you have to say by being open to what they have to say, then what's going to happen is you're just going to be pounding into them, and then you're going to get that right back. You're going to get them pounding you, meaning not listening to you, because that's what you did to them. So this is a front-loaded proposition as on the front end, that you're open to them, listening to them, loving them, and doing your best to hear them. They will then be loving and open and doing their best to hear you. So you get what, you reap what you sow. Are you going to sow that openness, which is back to the beginning of the podcast when we talked about, like, we're raising lawyers from the standpoint that they do feel like that they have a voice. Why? Because we have listened. And it took a while for me to be a listener, but I listen now.
And I think that listening, I think that there's probably this, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, this like gut feel that if I, as a parent, say something and then I change my mind, my kids aren't going to respect me because I'm inconsistent. And that's where I think the communication is so important. If the rule is over here one day, if the bedtime, just use a practical example, is 8 o'clock one day and the next day it's 10:30, then your kids are going to say, like, okay, like, we're smart. We knew, like, the bedtime is exactly 8 o'clock except when it's not. And so if we talk over the chimes of the grandfather clock in the in the kitchen, then we can go to bed whenever we want.
And you never did that, did you?
No, never. Absolutely not. We got away with it. But I think that if you as a parent communicate, you know what? The bedtime is usually 8 o'clock, but sometimes family time is more important than the schedule. And so we're going to watch a movie, and this movie's going to end at 9:30, and this is an exception to the rule, and here's why. Then it kind of reinforces why the rule existed in the first place, because bedtimes are important, but it also enforces a priority structure. And so I don't walk out of that thinking you're a bad parent because you were inconsistent. I walk out of that understanding the way that my parents think. And that actually trains me to start seeing your other decisions that I don't immediately understand as decisions that probably have reasons behind them.
Yeah, and I think that methodology requires, the first thing that requires is it's a death to self, that I have to say no to myself in order to be open, and that's painful. And it's fruitful. It's like birth, fruitful, and it's painful to engage. But I think the long term is where the fruit begins to show itself more in a way that that's extremely edifying, because when it comes to, and I've seen it with you and my other children, not that you always do it perfectly, but many times I've been in situations where there's an argument going on, even between you, a discussion that can turn into an argument, where I see both of you like asking questions and actually trying to understand the other person's perspective. And I remember one time in particular where one of my daughters was in a debate, kind of an ongoing discussion with you, and she could only see like one side. And at that point, it was like, boy, before you need to look beyond yourself, and to see like, is there another way to look at this? And it did come about that she was able to see things differently, and that in some ways you were able to show her a new perspective. And I could see the flip side; you saw things differently too. And so the growth that came from that was as a parent was edifying to see. And then it brings us back to where we started this conversation of how often that doesn't happen in society. And it's hard for it to happen out there, for you to listen to somebody out there when you haven't been listened to in your own household. And so, a lot of the blow up in society is a result of the blow up at homes. And we can point to reasons. There's been, a lot of ways in which we've been so focused on our careers or on leisure in a way that's disordered that we're not interacting with each other. And even, the advent of, smartphones and the way that we can use television and have video on demand, all that stuff has its place. But when it's taken center stage, then it forms me into to a person who's really focused in on myself and what I'm getting out of something, as opposed to being able to see from another perspective. And so, so the selfishness meaning the self-centered viewing that has happened in families is just rampant in society today. So you say, okay, well, great. What do we do about that? You do what you can do, which is back, in your home and in your relationships, that you can begin to model really listening and entering into discussion where you're trying to understand the other side. Because what you'll find is how many times, reminds me of an instance where you and I had a discussion, and you had been talking to Maria and one of your sisters, and I won't go into the specifics of it, but what happened, you were very upset with what they had to say. And so then we came into my office and we talked for a little bit, and actually had to do with a girl. And you said something like, well, I think she's really attractive. And I said, I do too. I think she is attractive. And then you're like, oh, okay. And then it changed the game, because then you were open to what I had to say, because she's a beautiful gal, like you were right. And so, but then that opened the door to where you could hear me more, and you're like, well, if you see that and you see that she's a good person, like she's a good person, but you don't think that that she's a fit. And I was like, and I don't. And then you were asking, well, why, openly, as opposed to having from the outside just being told you're wrong, because you weren't completely wrong. And this absolutism really is, it's like this color, again, back to the diamond, this, when you say that this is definitely yellow and somebody else sees from a different perspective, like, no, we need to realize that indeed there's more to it. There is more perspective. So let's get the perspectives on the table.
A friend of mine used to say that discussions and arguments are never about what they're about. That the thing that we are discussing is usually a proxy war for something else that's going on. For instance, a buddy of mine and I recently were getting into a discussion about this business idea that I was working on, and whether this certain figure would be a good publicity face for it. And he was basically saying this person is not worth that kind of investment. I was saying this person is worth that kind of investment. And it was getting kind of heated. And I realized that this wasn't actually what we were talking about. At the end of the day, what he was talking about was a worldview that he had, and how this person didn't really agree with that worldview. And so saying that this person was worth an investment would be admitting that a worldview he doesn't share has value. And that was something he was struggling with. Conversely, him saying that person wasn't worth the investment would call into question a whole bunch of my life choices. And so I couldn't agree with him without having to examine my own life and a lot of the decisions that I have made and am making. So our discussion had nothing to do with the individual we were discussing. It had everything to do with what's going on underneath. And so I think that that's a really it's so important to take the time after a discussion and be introspective for a second and ask, how did that go? What's now that I'm out of the heat of the moment, what was that person actually, what were they actually arguing about? And frankly, something that kind of came up as you were talking along those lines is, if you don't have the pattern of having those kind of truth-seeking discussions, if they tend to get really, hard-headed, butting heads on something, then it might be worth sitting down and asking your kids and just saying, you know what, do you think of me as somebody who is open to hearing what you have to say and changing my mind if you make a good point?
Yeah.
Which is probably not a fun question to ask your kids. But if you were to sit down and ask that question, I think that maybe not the first time, as you talked about before, maybe the kids say, oh, for sure, yeah, definitely. But I think that you might get an answer you don't want to hear, but it also opens up the follow-up question. Okay, I'm not that way, and I'm going to work really hard to change. I do want to know where you're coming from because I love you, and I think that, you're an awesome person. I want to know what you have to say. Now, do you think of yourself as the kind of person who is open to other opinions and willing to change their mind?
Yeah, I think that's what you just outlined is beautiful. And I think it brings to the table this whole idea of introspection, which we both need to do, because in any discussion, we need to know what's at play. What are the dogs at play in the discussion, so that we can hear better. It's like trying to get the wood out of my eye in order to be able to see more clearly what's happening with you. And I think it's important to do what you said, where you're stepping back out of an individual argument, discussion, debate. And just saying how well do I debate? How well do I discuss? And then there's one more step to that, where you have, before you're in or after you've been in a heated discussion, to talk about what are the rules? How do we want to in the future? How do we want to talk about things that are contentious? How are we going to do that? Because we see in society that, in the court, there's rules of engagement that you have that make sense, where you do, when you're in a court of law, you have the plaintiff put forward their complaint, and you have the other side be able to answer that, and you can go back and forth respectfully. And it doesn't include, I remember sitting in a homeowners association meeting where there really was a problematic thing going on. There was contentiousness on both sides, and there was one person in particular who basically just shouted down everybody. And I remember at the time thinking, what he was saying it had a lot of merit and was right, but his methodology was so offensive that nobody wanted to do what he was saying, even though it made sense, because he was just so rude, and he was so disrespectful of other perspectives which were at play too. So I think on the first thing, it's that introspective question, which is what you're asking, is how well am I being open? How well are you being open? And then secondly, let's talk about the rules of engagement of how we're going to enter into these discussions so that we are respectful. We do hear the other person through. And I'd give one more word of advice on that, is that two things. One is, when the other person makes a point that's right and good, go out of your way to say, I agree with that. Point out the area so that they know, okay, you do agree with that. And then secondly, as you're discussing, make sure to stop and say, so what I hear you saying is, and this isn't just a technique, but you explain their side. And until you explain their side, they're not going to feel heard. And if you just move on, they could have said 10 things and you agreed with 9, but you pick up the 10th thing that you disagree with. If you didn't tell them that you agreed with the first 9, there's a deficit there. And they don't realize oh, you agree with 1 through 9. Yeah, I totally do. We're on the same page. They're going to be more open to you when you go to discuss the 10th thing.
And the important thing when you're doing that is to strongman their argument. The fallacy we've all heard is the straw man argument, where you basically make the dumb version of their argument and then pick it apart. Strongman their argument. Because there were times where you would use that as a technique, and it was definitely a technique with me, and I felt like what you spoke back to me was the dumbest version of my argument. And that is actually not just not moving the argument forward, it's moving it backwards. Because if you straw man my argument, the subtext is you're so dumb that I'm going to play this argument back to you in a dumb way. And so I think it's a great point that you have to make sure that they know they're being heard, but that doesn't mean say back what they said in a way that makes it sound stupid so they understand how stupid their argument is. It's like, no, like, you didn't make this argument, but like the best version of your argument as I see it is this, and that's what I'm going to give you credit for. Because at the end of the day, I'm not trying to tear you apart. I'm trying to come to truth.
Amen. I think that's well said. And I think it's important. I'm glad that you, as my son, are putting that forward, because I think other parents can listen and say, obviously I did that. And then they could say, gosh, I wonder if I've done that too. And it's like, and is that the kind of parent that I want to be? And is that a parent that's reflecting the face of God? It's not. The hope is that you can change and begin to help your children to be seen, to be loved, to be listened to. That's all we have time for today. If you like what you've heard on the podcast, please subscribe, leave a 5-star review, and encourage your friends and family to do the same. If you want to support the work of Strong Catholic Dad, you can become a monthly sponsor for as little as $5 a month. I quit my job back in 2018 to found Strong Catholic Dad, and as of right now, it's not enough to pay the bills. So anything that you can do is appreciated. Until next time, be strong in faith, strong in hope, and strong in love. God bless.